80,000 men felt it before they understood it. Not in their ears. In their teeth. In the marrow of their bones. In the part of the brain that doesn't think, the part that knows, the way a gazelle knows the grass has gone too quiet, the way a sailor knows the water has pulled too far from shore. Something was wrong with the ground. Then something was wrong with the air. A sound, rising, sharpening, climbing past wind into something that had no name, a shrieking, whistling roar like God dragging a blade across the sky. It swallowed the battlefield whole. Cannons went silent beneath it. Musket volleys disappeared. The screams of dying men became nothing. 80,000 soldiers stopped fighting, not because they chose to, but because every animal instinct they had fired at once and said the same thing: turn around. They turned around. The sun was gone. Where it had been, a ridge line, boiling with shadow and steel, cresting the hill at full gallop. 3,000 armored riders, and every single one of them had wings. Massive eagle-feathered frames bolted to their backs, arching above their helmets, rising and falling with the rhythm of the gallop, producing a shrieking wail that sounded less like cavalry and more like the sky had opened and something had come through. 3,000 winged men. Charging 80,000. The largest cavalry charge in recorded human history lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, one of the most powerful armies ever assembled didn't retreat. It ceased to exist, psychologically annihilated, shattered so completely that soldiers who had conquered half of Europe threw down their weapons and trampled each other to escape men who should not have been able to touch them. The date was September 12, 1683. And the men with wings were real. And nothing, about what happened that day should have been possible. But here's what no one tells you. The charge wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that anyone was alive to attempt the charge. Because 2 months before those wings darkened the sky, an entire continent watched a city of innocent people get strangled to death, and did absolutely nothing to stop it. That's the part history leaves out. And that's where this story actually begins. Rewind to spring. Erase the glory. Erase the wings and the thunder and the impossible mathematics of 3,000 breaking 80,000. Go back to the moment before any of it mattered, to a road in Hungary, choked with dust, vibrating under a weight the earth itself seemed to resist. 150,000 men. Marching west. Picture that number. Not as a statistic. As a physical reality. A column of soldiers so long, so impossibly dense, that a man standing at the roadside would watch for 3 full hours before the last wagon rolled past. 3 hours of boots crushing packed dirt into powder. 3 hours of cavalry horses stamping and snorting, their breath hanging in the humid air like small ghosts. 3 hours of cannon wheels grinding ruts into roads built for merchant carts, not siege artillery. 3 hours of supply wagons groaning under the weight of gunpowder, grain, rope, shovels, medical supplies, and the 1,000 mundane necessities that keep a killing machine fed and functional. And above all of it, the banners. Crescent flags in green and gold and crimson, so numerous they stopped looking like flags and started looking like a second sky descending over Europe. They rippled in the hot wind that swept the Hungarian plains, and their shadows moved across the ground like clouds, vast, dark, and impossible to outrun. This was the Ottoman war machine at the peak of its terrifying perfection. And the man riding at its head intended to use every ounce of that perfection to break the Western world in half. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was not a cautious man. Caution was for diplomats. For merchants. For the small, careful minds that populated the lower rungs of the Ottoman court, men who measured their ambitions in acres rather than continents. Mustafa measured his ambition in civilizations. He had carved a corridor of conquest through the Balkans so thorough, so systematic, that the cities he left behind didn't just surrender, they stopped existing as anything other than Ottoman outposts, their churches converted, their populations absorbed, their histories rewritten in a language the original inhabitants could not read. He had never lost a campaign. Let that settle. In an era when military failure was measured in mass graves and severed heads delivered to throne rooms in velvet bags, Kara Mustafa Pasha had never once tasted defeat. Every fortress he besieged had fallen. Every army he faced had broken. Every gamble he took had paid off with the regularity of a natural law. And now Sultan Mehmed IV had pointed him toward the greatest prize of all. Vienna. The golden apple. That ancient symbol of world dominion that Ottoman strategists had coveted for 2 centuries, the city whose fall would crack Europe open like a walnut beneath an iron heel. Mustafa didn't just want Vienna. He needed it. The Sultan had made the terms explicit: deliver the golden apple, and power beyond imagination was his. Fail, and well. Ottoman sultans did not discuss failure. They discussed silk cords and velvet bags. But Mustafa wasn't thinking about failure. Not today. Not with 150,000 men at his back and a continent too fractured to mount a defense. He was thinking about the geography of what came after. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany stretched open, flat, fertile, indefensible. If Germany buckled, Italy would tremble, its squabbling city-states incapable of unified resistance. If Italy trembled, France would negotiate. And if France negotiated, the map of the world redraws itself. Permanently. He turned his face west and smiled. What he did not do, what he never once did, in all his months of planning, was look north. That single failure of imagination would cost him everything. But we'll get to that. If you're waiting for Europe to save itself, stop. Here's the part that should make your blood pressure spike. Because the continent Mustafa was marching toward, the civilization that stood to lose everything if Vienna fell, responded to the greatest existential threat in its history with something worse than defeat. It responded with nothing. The Holy Roman Empire, that magnificent, creaking fraud of a political structure that claimed dominion over Central Europe, was paralyzed. Not by Ottoman strength. By its own politics. Internal rivalries so tangled, so petty, so suffocatingly Byzantine, that untangling them would exhaust a team of scholars working for a decade. Princes feuded with princes. Electors schemed against electors. Catholic and Protestant nursed hatred still raw from the 30 Years' War, a conflict that had ended barely 35 years earlier and left 8 million dead, a number so large that entire regions of Germany had lost half their population and still hadn't recovered. These were people who had watched their own neighbors burn villages, slaughter families, and salt fields in the name of theological disagreements most of them couldn't even articulate. And now they were supposed to unite against an external threat. Together. They couldn't even agree on a dinner menu. And their emperor, the man theoretically responsible for defending Christendom's eastern gate, had already made his decision. Leopold I of Austria packed his court into carriages on the 7th of July, 1683. He loaded his ministers, his advisers, his family, his personal treasury, everything that mattered to him, and retreated west to the safety of Passau, 150 miles from danger. Now, imagine you are a citizen of Vienna. Imagine standing on a street corner as the imperial carriages roll past, gilded, curtained, heavy with the weight of privilege, heading away from the city you cannot leave. Heading toward safety you will never reach. The emperor does not look out the window. His coachman does not slow down. The hooves clatter on cobblestone, and the sound fades, and then there is silence. That silence is the sound of abandonment. And every soul left inside those walls heard it. But surely someone would help. Surely the other great powers, France, the Italian states, the Protestant North, would recognize that this was bigger than any single rivalry. That an Ottoman Vienna meant an Ottoman Europe. That the fire burning at the eastern gate would eventually consume every house on the street. Surely. France watched from the shadows, and its king did math. Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose appetite for continental domination rivaled Mustafa's own, looked at the situation and saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. Austria's destruction was France's elevation. Vienna's fall was Paris's gain. The calculus was cold, simple, and devastating in its selfishness. Louis did not send a single soldier east. He sent spies instead, to watch, to measure, to prepare for the vacuum that Austria's collapse would leave behind. The Italian states bickered. Their ancient rivalries burned brighter in their minds than any distant Ottoman campfire. Venice calculated trade routes. The Papal States issued proclamations that carried all the military weight of a strongly worded letter. Genoa and Florence looked at their own walls and decided those walls were someone else's problem. The Protestant North remembered its dead. 8 million of them. Killed by Catholic armies in wars fought over the correct way to worship the same God. And now those same Catholics wanted help. From the people they'd spent a generation slaughtering. Europe did not unite. Europe did not mobilize. Europe sat in its separate rooms, behind its separate doors, nursing its separate wounds, and waited for someone else to deal with the monster at the gate. An entire civilization, fractured, bitter, exhausted, selfish, staring at the abyss and choosing to look away. If this is the first time you're hearing how close the entire Western world came to collapsing, not because of military weakness, but because of political cowardice, then you need to subscribe to this channel. Because the history you were taught in school left this part out on purpose. Hit subscribe. Stay with me. Because what happens next defies everything you think you know about how the world gets saved. Every court turned away. Every throne room calculated its own survival. Every nation decided that Vienna was Vienna's problem and closed the curtains. Every nation except one. And the man who ruled it was 60 years old, overweight, scarred across half his body, nearly bankrupt, and commanding a kingdom so exhausted it could barely defend its own borders, let alone ride 500 miles through mountains and storms to save a city that had never once done anything for him. His name was Jan Sobieski. And he was about to do something that rational men would call insane, military strategists would call suicidal, and history would struggle for 300 years to call anything other than a miracle. But first, Vienna had to survive long enough for him to arrive. And inside those walls, survival had already stopped looking like something anyone recognized. What those 15,000 defenders endured over the next 60 days isn't warfare. It's something closer to being buried alive, slowly, methodically, by an enemy so patient he was willing to let hunger and disease do work his cannons couldn't. And the man orchestrating that slow burial was eating lamb and honey in a silk tent while he watched. That's next. The first mine detonated on July 23. Not above ground, below it. Deep beneath the Berg Bastion, where Ottoman sappers had spent 9 days digging a tunnel so narrow that men crawled through it on their bellies, dragging barrels of gunpowder behind them by rope, breathing air so thin and foul that several collapsed before reaching the end. They packed the charge against the foundation stones, lit a slow fuse, and crawled backward into the dark. The defenders above felt it before they heard it. A vibration in the soles of their feet, subtle at first, almost like the purring of some enormous animal beneath the floor. Then the stones shifted. A crack split the courtyard flagstones from one side to the other, and for a single heartbeat, the entire bastion seemed to inhale, pulling inward, downward, as though the earth had opened its mouth. Then it exhaled. 40 tons of masonry erupted upward in a column of fire and pulverized stone that reached higher than the cathedral spire. Men standing on the bastion didn't fall. They were launched, hurled outward like ragdolls, their bodies tumbling through smoke so thick it blotted out the July sun. The sound arrived a fraction of a second later, a deep, percussive crack that shattered windows 3 streets away and left every survivor within 200 yards temporarily deaf. When the dust cleared, the bastion was gone. In its place, a crater. A gap in Vienna's defenses wide enough to march a column of infantry through shoulder to shoulder. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg stood on the remnants of the adjacent wall and stared into the breach. His face was gray with stone dust. Blood ran from his left ear where the concussion had burst something delicate inside. His hands were steady. He turned to his officers and gave an order that, under the circumstances, bordered on the deranged. Fill it. Starhemberg was not a complicated man. He did not possess Sobieski's burning faith or Mustafa's theatrical ambition. He possessed something rarer and, in the arithmetic of this particular siege, far more valuable. He possessed the ability to look at a situation that every rational mind would classify as hopeless, and simply refuse to acknowledge the classification. 15,000 defenders. 150,000 besiegers. Walls built for an age before gunpowder. No relief army on the horizon. No promise of rescue. No guarantee that the dispatches he sent through enemy lines were reaching anyone at all, or that anyone who received them would act on a single word. He did not care. Not because he was brave in the storybook sense, not because he lacked the imagination to understand his own death. He understood it perfectly. He had written his will the day before the siege began. He had said his confession. He had made his peace with God and his debts with men and settled every account that a man settles when he does not expect to see another autumn. And then he had climbed the walls and started fighting. Every morning, he walked the full circuit of the fortifications. Every morning, there were new breaches. New sections of wall cracked or collapsed or undermined by tunnels he could hear being dug beneath his feet, a sound that drove some men mad, that constant scraping and tapping below the ground, like rats in the walls of a house that was slowly being eaten from the inside. He counted the breaches the way a doctor counts tumors. Clinically. Without flinching. And then he ordered them filled, with rubble, with timber, with furniture dragged from abandoned houses, with anything that could be stacked and packed into a gap to buy another day, another hour, another 60 minutes of existence for a city that was running out of all three. His garrison bled. 200 men the first week. 300 the second. By August, he was losing 100 men a day, killed by Ottoman musket fire from the trenches that crept closer each night, killed by mine explosions that collapsed entire sections of wall without warning, killed by shrapnel and stone fragments and 1,000 random cruelties that a siege inflicts on bodies trapped in a confined space under constant bombardment. By the end of August, he had 4,000 men still capable of holding a weapon. Many of them were wounded. All of them were starving. He did not discuss surrender. Not once. Not privately. Not in his journal. Not in whispered conversations with officers who had every right to raise the subject. The word did not exist in his vocabulary, not because he had removed it through some act of heroic will, but because he genuinely did not consider it an option. Surrender meant the city's population enslaved or slaughtered. Surrender meant the gate to Europe swinging open. Surrender meant everything, lost. So he kept filling breaches. And his men kept dying. And the mathematics kept getting worse. Inside the walls, Vienna was eating itself alive. The food ran out in stages, each stage more degrading than the last, each one stripping away another layer of the civilization these people had built and replacing it with something raw, animal, and desperate. First the bread disappeared. Then the meat. Then the vegetables, the dried fruit, the stored grain that was supposed to last through winter. People turned to horse meat, slaughtering the cavalry mounts that could no longer be fed, butchering animals that had carried soldiers into battle and now carried the taste of desperation into the mouths of their owners. When the horses were gone, they ate cats. When the cats were gone, they ate rats, hunted through cellars and sewers by children who had learned to move quietly in the dark, skinned and roasted over small fires that had to be kept low because smoke attracted Ottoman snipers. When the rats grew scarce, they boiled leather. Belts. Boot soles. Saddle straps. Anything made of cured animal hide went into pots of water heated over fires fed by broken furniture, producing a thin, bitter liquid that provided almost no nourishment but filled the stomach just enough to quiet the cramps for an hour. Maybe two. A woman on the wool's aisle, her name is lost, like so many names from this siege, fed her 2 children boiled leather soup every evening and told them it was beef broth. They were 4 and 6. They believed her. She did not eat. Mothers in sieges rarely do. The water failed next. Wells that had served the city for generations turned foul, contaminated by the corpses that accumulated faster than the living could bury them, by the sewage that backed up when the infrastructure broke down, by the sheer biological reality of 60,000 people packed into a space designed for half that number with no sanitation and no clean supply. Dysentery spread through the shelters like fire through straw. Fever followed. Wounds that should have healed in a week turned septic because there was no clean water to wash them, no food to give the body strength to fight infection, no medicine that could compensate for an immune system running on leather soup and terror. The very old died first. Then the very young. Not from Ottoman steel, from hunger, from thirst, from diseases that a healthy body could have shrugged off in days. They died quietly, in corners, in beds, in the arms of people who loved them and could do nothing except hold them and watch and add another name to a list that grew longer every morning. And still the living fought. A boy, 14, perhaps 15, the records are unclear, carried stones to fill a breach on the Lobel bastion every day for 3 weeks. The stones weighed 40, 50 pounds. He staggered under them. His hands bled. His spine compressed under loads that would have challenged a grown laborer working a full shift on a full stomach. He was working a full shift on no stomach at all. No one ordered him to do this. No one asked. He simply appeared each morning at the rubble pile, loaded his arms, and walked toward the gap in the wall. He is not named in any record that survives. He may have lived. He may have died in the final days when the breaches multiplied faster than anyone could fill them. His story exists only as a footnote in a garrison commander's log, a single line noting that children assist in repairs. That single line contains more courage than most histories bother to record. Across the siege lines, in a tent that cost more than most Viennese families earned in a lifetime, Kara Mustafa Pasha poured himself tea. His pavilion was silk. His carpets were Persian. His cushions were stuffed with down, his plates were silver, and the lamb on those plates was seasoned with saffron and honey and herbs grown in gardens maintained by servants who traveled with the army for exactly this purpose. Musicians played in the evenings, soft, intricate melodies on strings and reed instruments, drifting across the no-man's land on the warm September air to reach the ears of defenders who hadn't eaten solid food in a week. It was not accidental. Nothing about Mustafa was accidental. He had built a camp so vast it took an hour to walk from end to end. Bazaars appeared between the pavilions, merchants who followed the army selling silk, spices, jewelry, coffee, luxuries that the soldiers purchased with the spoils of conquered cities still warm from burning. It was less a military camp than a mobile city, complete with its own economy, its own social hierarchy, its own rhythms of commerce and leisure that existed in parallel to the siege like a marketplace adjacent to an execution. Foreign ambassadors visited. He received them in his pavilion with the graciousness of a host welcoming guests to a banquet, gesturing toward the crumbling walls of Vienna with the casual ease of a man indicating the evening's entertainment. Look. See how the bastion sags. Observe the breach. Note the absence of return fire, they are running out of powder. It is nearly finished. His officers pressed him. Storm the breaches. The gaps are wide enough for cavalry. The defenders are starving, their numbers halved, their ammunition dwindling. One coordinated assault, overwhelming force through 3 breaches simultaneously, and Vienna falls before sunset. Mustafa waved them away. Why spend Ottoman lives when Austrian hunger would deliver the same result for free? Why sacrifice janissaries when dysentery was killing defenders more efficiently than any musket ball? Time was his weapon. Patience was his strategy. And both were working. He took another sip of tea. He did not look at the hills to the north. He did not imagine that any force in Europe possessed the will, the speed, or the insanity to march 500 miles through mountain passes to challenge the largest army on the continent. His generals would later testify that they begged him, not once, but repeatedly, to fortify the camp's northern perimeter. To dig trenches facing the Kahlenberg heights. To position artillery against a relief force that every military manual in existence warned him to prepare for. He refused every time. Remember that. Hold it in your mind. Because the most powerful military commander in the world just made a decision based on an assumption, the assumption that no one was coming, and that assumption is about to collide with a 60-year-old Polish king who has been riding south through thunderstorms for 3 weeks with murder in his heart and a prayer on his lips. But that collision is still days away. And Vienna doesn't have days. September 9th. 2 months into the siege. The inner walls are cracking. Starhemberg stands on what remains of the Berg Ravelin and counts 3 breaches wide enough to ride a wagon through. The outer fortifications have been reduced to rubble in 6 places. The garrison is below 4,000. Powder reserves will last, he calculates carefully, because careful calculation is all he has left, perhaps 72 hours of sustained firing. After that, the muskets become clubs. He writes in his journal by candlelight. The candle gutters with each distant explosion. Plaster dust drifts from the ceiling and settles on the page like gray snow. We are living ghosts defending a tomb. Yet we will not yield. He calls for a volunteer. The mission is straightforward in description and suicidal in execution. Slip through the Ottoman siege lines at night. Navigate a perimeter patrolled by thousands of sentries, reinforced by watchfires every 50 yards, monitored by cavalry pickets who ride the outer ring in continuous rotation specifically to intercept messengers. Cross miles of enemy-held territory in darkness. Reach the Danube. Find someone, anyone, on the other side who can carry a message to whoever might be listening. A young officer steps forward. His name is not reliably recorded. He is 23 or 24. He knows what volunteering means. Everyone in the room knows what volunteering means. Starhemberg hands him a message. It is the shortest dispatch he has ever written. Every word previous messages contained, the tactical assessments, the supply inventories, the careful diplomatic language designed to convey urgency without appearing desperate, has been stripped away. What remains is bone. Come now, or do not come at all. We have days. Perhaps hours. The young officer leaves through a gap in the eastern wall at 3 in the morning on September 10th. He disappears into the darkness beyond the fortifications, into the maze of Ottoman trenches and campfires and roving patrols, carrying 11 words that represent the last breath of a city that has been suffocating for 60 days. No one in Vienna knows if he made it. No one knows if the message will reach anyone. No one knows if anyone is even out there to receive it. They stand on the walls and stare into the dark and listen for sounds that don't come. And then, on the night of September 10th, a sentry on the northern wall sees something. Faint. Distant. Almost certainly a trick of exhaustion and desperation on eyes that haven't slept properly in weeks. But he swears, he saw a flicker of light on the Kahlenberg hills. A signal fire. Brief as a heartbeat. Then gone. Another sentry hears trumpets. Far away. Distorted by distance and wind and the acoustics of mountain valleys. But trumpets nonetheless. Military trumpets. Playing a call that is not Ottoman. Word spreads through the city the way fire moves through a building that has given up trying to resist, fast, hot, consuming everything in its path. People climb to the walls. Thousands of them. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, trembling with starvation and disease and something they haven't felt in so long they almost don't recognize it. They stare north into absolute darkness. They see nothing. And then dawn breaks on September 11th, and what they see on those hills changes everything. But the man riding at the front of that army, the man who ignored every rational voice telling him this was madness, had already paid a price to get there that most people cannot fathom. And the price he would pay after the battle was even worse. That's the part no one teaches you. Banners. That's what the sentries saw first. Not men. Not horses. Not the glint of armor or the shapes of cannon barrels catching the early light. Banners, hundreds of them, cresting the Kahlenberg ridge in the pale gray of pre-dawn like a forest growing sideways out of the hills. The double-headed eagle of the Holy Roman Empire, gold thread on black silk. The white eagle of Poland, fierce, angular, ancient. The standards of Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, a patchwork of heraldry that represented something that hadn't existed in decades and by all rational logic should not have existed now. A united Christendom. Standing on the hills above Vienna. Inside the city, something broke. Not walls this time, something else. Something interior. The careful, hard-packed emotional numbness that 60 days of siege had compressed into every surviving soul cracked open like ice on a spring river, and what poured through the fractures was so raw, so violent, so physically overwhelming that people collapsed where they stood. Church bells rang. For the first time in 8 weeks, the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral, silenced since July to conserve the energy of the men who pulled the ropes, erupted into sound. It cascaded through streets choked with rubble and the smell of unburied dead, bounced off walls scarred by cannon fire, poured into cellars where families had lived in darkness for weeks. And it carried a message simpler and older than language itself. Someone came. Women wept in doorways. Soldiers, hard men, men who had watched friends torn apart by mine explosions without changing expression, sank to their knees on the ramparts and pressed their foreheads against stone still warm from yesterday's fires. A priest on the Moker bastion began reciting the Te Deum in a voice so shattered by emotion that the words came out in fragments. Others joined him. Then others. Then the sound spread across the walls until the entire northern perimeter of Vienna was singing, thousands of starving, bleeding, half-dead voices lifted toward a ridge they could barely see through eyes blurred with tears. They did not know the numbers. They did not know the plan. They did not know if the army on those hills was large enough to fight what waited below. They only knew one name. And they whispered it like a prayer. The Polish king is coming. Jan Sobieski did not look like a savior. Strip away the portraits painted after the battle, the ones that slimmed his waist, squared his jaw, and mounted him on horses more magnificent than any he actually rode. Strip away the poetry and the ballads and the retrospective glory that history drapes over men once it has decided they belong in the pantheon. Look at the man himself, as he existed in September of 1683. He was 60 years old. Heavy-set, thick through the chest and belly, carrying the accumulated weight of decades spent at war tables and banquet tables in roughly equal measure. His hair had gone gray. His knees ached in cold weather. His back seized if he spent more than 4 hours in the saddle without dismounting, a problem for a man who had just spent 3 weeks riding through mountain passes where dismounting meant falling behind and falling behind meant Vienna died. His face told the real story. Weathered. Creased. Marked by sun and wind and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from missed sleep but from 30 years of carrying a kingdom on shoulders that were never quite broad enough for the load. He had fought in more than 30 major engagements, against Turk, against Tatar, against Cossack, against Swedish armies that descended on Poland like locusts during the wars that nearly erased his country from the map a generation before he was born. Every one of those battles had left something behind. Scars he no longer catalogued. A stiffness in his right shoulder where a Tatar lance had found a gap in his armor at Pothatch. A recurring pain in his left hip that his physicians attributed to too many years absorbing the impact of cavalry charges through a pelvis that was, after all, human bone and not iron. He was not a romantic figure. He was a survivor. And there is a difference, a vast, unpoetic difference, between the two. But something burned inside this battered, aging, overweight king that his enemies had learned to fear more than any weapon in his arsenal. His faith. Not the decorative, performative faith of courtiers who attended Mass because protocol required it and forgot God the moment they left the chapel. His was the hard, uncompromising faith of a man who had knelt in mud on too many battlefields, surrounded by the dead and the dying, and found something in the silence that did not flinch. Something that did not calculate odds. Something that pointed at him, specifically, personally, unavoidably, and said go. Every advisor told him not to. His treasury was empty. His nobles were hostile, the same, Poland's fractious parliament, saw no reason to bankrupt the nation for an Austrian emperor who had never lifted a finger for Polish interests. His own borders were bleeding. Tatar raiders struck the eastern frontier with the regularity of seasons, and every soldier he pulled west was a soldier who wasn't defending Polish villages from being burned to the ground and their inhabitants dragged into slavery. The mathematics said stay home. The politics said stay home. The economics said stay home. Every rational calculation a king could perform pointed to the same conclusion: Vienna is not your problem. Sobieski ignored all of it. He sent his message south. For words that contain no diplomatic nuance, no conditional clauses, no negotiating positions. For words that burned through the noise of a continent paralyzed by self-interest and landed on the desk of Vienna's defenders like a lit match on dry timber. Hold! I am coming. Then he gathered every man who could ride and began moving south. Not because the numbers made sense. Not because the politics aligned. Not because anyone had promised him anything in return. Because he understood, in his bones, in his scarred and aching body, in the part of his mind that operated below calculation, that some moments do not ask permission. They issue orders. And the order this moment issued was simple: ride, or watch the world burn. He rode. The march should have killed them before the Ottomans got the chance. 500 miles. Through the Carpathian passes in late summer, when storms descend without warning and turn mountain trails into rivers of mud that swallow horses to their bellies. Through forests so dense and old that sunlight disappeared for days at a stretch, replaced by a green half-darkness that made men feel they had crossed into some older, wilder world that didn't recognize their maps or care about their mission. Across rivers swollen with rain, the crossings alone consumed hours, horses fighting currents that dragged them downstream, powder supplies soaking in waterproof cases that weren't quite waterproof enough, men hauling artillery through water chest deep while the clock in Vienna wound down toward zero. They moved at speeds that military historians still struggle to explain. 40 miles a day. 50 when the dispatches from Vienna arrived, carried by riders on horses so lathered and broken that some collapsed and died the moment they stopped, bearing messages that shrank with each delivery. Fewer words. Shorter sentences. The handwriting of men running out of time and ink and hope, in that order. Sobieski's men slept in their saddles. Not real sleep, the shallow, half-conscious drift of bodies pushed past their design limits, brains shutting down in fragments while hands still gripped reins and spines still absorbed the rhythm of the horse beneath them. They ate in the saddle because stopping meant losing minutes and minutes meant lives, and the lives were not abstract. They were the women boiling leather and the boys carrying stones and the old men staring into darkness on walls that were crumbling faster than anyone could repair. At the vanguard rode the Hussars. 3,000 of them. And they were something the world had never seen before and would never see again. Picture them. Not as museum exhibits or textbook illustrations, as physical, breathing, terrifying realities bearing down on you at the speed of a galloping horse. Armor of polished steel fitted to each rider's body by master armorers who spent months on a single suit, adjusting every plate and joint until the metal moved with the man like a second skin. Beneath the steel, mail, thousands of interlocking rings that caught the light and scattered it in patterns that made each rider shimmer like something pulled from deep water. And from their backs, the wings. Wooden frames arching above each rider's shoulders, studded with eagle feathers harvested from the Carpathian Mountains and arranged in a specific pattern developed over generations. They rose 2 feet, sometimes 3, above the rider's head, and they served a purpose so psychologically devastating that enemies who survived encountering them described the experience using the language of nightmares rather than military reports. At rest, they were strange. Beautiful, perhaps. Ceremonial. At full gallop, they became something else entirely. The feathers caught the wind and vibrated, thousands of quills oscillating at slightly different frequencies, producing a sound that defied easy description. A whistling. A shrieking. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that built and layered and multiplied as 3,000 sets of wings hit full velocity simultaneously. Survivors on both sides of Hussar charges used the same word, independently, across decades of testimony. Unearthly. Each rider carried a lance 18 feet long, copia, they called it, made of hollow wood, light enough to couch under one arm at full gallop, strong enough at impact velocity to penetrate a mounted man, his armor, and his horse, and emerge from the other side. They trained with these weapons from the age of 12. By the time a hussar rode to war, the lance was less an instrument he wielded than an extension of his body, as natural as a finger, as precise as a surgeon's blade, and considerably more lethal than either. They were nobility. Every one of them. Landowners, titleholders, men who commanded servants and managed estates and could trace their bloodlines back generations. Any one of them could have stayed home. Could have watched this crisis unfold from the comfort of a manor house 500 miles from the nearest Ottoman soldier. Could have calculated, correctly, that Poland's survival did not technically require their personal presence on a hillside above Vienna. They rode anyway. A man named Stanislav, his family name appears in the muster rolls but has been partially damaged, the surname smudged by water or time, left an estate in Lesser Poland with 40 horses and 12 retainers. He was 31. He had a wife and a daughter who was 3. He wrote a letter before departure that survived in a family archive until the 18th century. One line from it was copied into a parish record before the original was lost. If God wills that I do not return, tell my Anna that her father rode toward the right thing. Whether he returned is not recorded. Hold that. At Thon, on the banks of the Danube, the pieces came together, and almost fell apart. Sobieski's Poles met Duke Charles of Lorraine and the imperial forces on September 5. The combined army numbered roughly 70,000, infantry, cavalry, artillery, drawn from a half-dozen nations whose mutual suspicions ran deeper than any alliance of convenience could fully dissolve. The Poles looked at the Austrians and saw the subjects of an emperor who had fled his own capital and left his people to starve. The Austrians looked at the Poles and saw eastern frontiersmen, brave, certainly, but unsophisticated, their methods outdated, their kingdom a buffer state that Vienna's court discussed with polite condescension when it discussed Poland at all. Catholic Bavarians stood beside Protestant Saxons, men whose theological disagreements had fueled wars that killed millions within living memory. Franconians and Swabians eyed each other with the low-grade territorial suspicion of neighbors who had been stealing each other's land for centuries. This was not a coalition forged by trust. It was a coalition forged by the absence of alternatives. Vienna was dying. The Ottoman tide would not stop at the Danube, it had never stopped anywhere it was not physically thrown back. If Vienna fell today, Munich fell tomorrow. If Munich fell, Dresden followed. And then Paris. And then whatever was left. So they swallowed their hatreds. Not permanently. Not completely. But enough. Sobieski took command. Not because the Austrian generals wanted him to, several of them bristled visibly at subordinating imperial forces to a Polish king, but because he was the only man present who had defeated Ottoman armies in open battle. Repeatedly. His victory at Kotin a decade earlier had shattered a Turkish force twice his size and established his reputation as the single most dangerous cavalry commander alive. The Austrians could resent him all they wanted. They could not argue with his record. He studied the terrain above Vienna for 2 days. The Kahlenberg Heights, steep, forested, broken by ravines and vineyards and small villages that clung to the slopes like barnacles. Below, the Ottoman camp spread across the plains in every direction, a canvas city that seemed to have no edge, no boundary, no end. Beyond it, Vienna, small from this distance, smoke-wreathed, its walls visibly shattered even from miles away. 70,000 against 150,000. On terrain that favored neither side. With an army that had never fought together, never trained together, and barely trusted each other enough to share a campfire. He formed a plan. And the plan was insane. Infantry descends at dawn. Engages the Ottoman left and center through the vineyards and villages on the slopes, brutal, close-quarters fighting designed not to break the Ottoman line but to pin it, fix Mustafa's attention forward. Force him to commit his reserves to the infantry battle. Stretch his formation thin. Then, and only then, the cavalry. All of it. Every mounted unit in the Allied army, 18,000 horsemen total, with the 3,000 Winged Hussars at the spearhead. Held back all day. Hidden behind the ridge. Waiting for the single moment when the Ottoman reserves are committed and the camp behind the line stands exposed. One charge. Downhill. At full velocity. Into the teeth of the largest army on the continent. No cavalry force in history had attempted anything of this scale. The mathematics of it were staggering, 18,000 riders hitting a formation of 80,000 men across a front less than 2 miles wide. If the charge stalled, if the horses stumbled on broken ground, if the Ottoman line held for even 90 seconds, the riders would be swallowed whole. Absorbed into a mass of infantry that outnumbered them 4-1 and cut to pieces at close quarters where their speed and momentum meant nothing. There was no fallback plan. No second wave. No reserve held in case of failure. Everything, every rider, every lance, every horse, every prayer uttered by every man who had ridden 500 miles to reach this hillside, would be committed in a single, irreversible moment. The entire battle, the entire siege, the entire future of the continent, compressed into 20 minutes. Sobieski looked at his officers. None of them spoke. The silence said everything. They understood the odds, and they had made their peace with them the same way their king had, miles ago, in the mountains, in the rain, in the dark. Dawn was coming. And with it, the most violent day in the 17th century. What happened next took less time than it takes to read about it. But the men who lived through it never stopped hearing the sound. September 12, 1683. 4 in the morning. The sky still black. On the Kahlenberg summit, in a clearing between the trees, a Capuchin friar named Marco Diaviano stood before a makeshift altar and raised the host. The altar was a wooden table. The chalice was borrowed. The vestments were stained from 3 weeks of travel through mountain passes. None of it mattered. What mattered was that 70,000 men, Poles, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons, Franconians, Swabians, men who days ago had regarded each other with suspicion and resentment, knelt together in the darkness on cold ground and bowed their heads. Sobieski knelt at the front. His armor was already buckled. His saber hung at his side. His son Jakub, 25 years old and riding into his first major battle, knelt beside him. The king's lips moved in prayer, but the words were inaudible, private, between a man and whatever force he believed had brought him 500 miles through storms to this precise hillside at this precise hour. The friar spoke the blessing. His voice carried through the trees, thin, clear, almost fragile against the weight of what was about to happen. Then silence. A silence so complete that men later claimed they could hear their own heartbeats, could hear the breathing of the horses tethered behind the tree line, could hear, faintly, distantly, like a sound from another world, the Ottoman drums still beating below in the darkness. Sobieski stood. Crossed himself. Turned to face an army that was watching him with the intensity of men who had staked their lives on his judgment. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment itself had not already spoken. The infantry began moving downhill at 5. The first hours were butchery. The Kahlenberg slopes were not open ground, they were a maze of terraced vineyards, stone walls, sunken lanes, and small villages whose houses and barns had been converted into Ottoman strongpoints. Every 50 yards presented a new obstacle. Every obstacle was defended by men who understood that the hills above them were the only direction from which death could come and had spent 2 months preparing accordingly. Austrian and Imperial infantry descended into this maze at dawn and immediately discovered that the terrain turned every advance into an intimate, grinding, close-quarters nightmare. Musket fire erupted from windows, from behind walls, from positions so well concealed that soldiers walked past them and took fire from behind. Smoke filled the vineyard lanes within the first hour, thick, white, acrid, reducing visibility to 20 yards, then 10, then arm's length. A Saxon sergeant, his name preserved in a regimental diary, described the fighting in the vineyards as killing in a maze built by the devil. Men died within touching distance of each other. Bayonets and sabers did work that muskets were too slow to accomplish. The reload time for a flintlock was 30 seconds under ideal conditions, and nothing about the conditions in those vineyards was ideal. Men grappled in the dirt between the vine rows, Ottoman and Christian tangled together in the smoke, indistinguishable by nationality, distinguishable only by the sounds they made when steel found flesh. By noon, the Allied infantry had advanced less than 2 miles. Casualties were mounting, 500 dead, twice that wounded, and the Ottoman line was holding. Not just holding, counterattacking. Mustafa, finally recognizing the threat from the north, had begun wheeling units away from the siege lines and sending them uphill into the vineyards. Fresh troops. Rested troops. Men who hadn't spent 10 hours fighting through smoke and stone walls. The Allied advance stalled. On the left flank, a Bavarian regiment broke. Simply broke, the cumulative pressure of hours of close combat, mounting casualties, and the sight of fresh Ottoman reinforcements pouring into the vineyard lanes overwhelmed whatever reserves of courage and discipline remained. Men turned and ran uphill, streaming past their officers, deaf to orders, blind to everything except the animal imperative to escape. A Bavarian colonel, his name was Dupigny, French-born, serving in the German forces, rode into the retreating men and physically struck soldiers with the flat of his sword, screaming at them to reform. Some stopped. Some didn't. The line bent but, barely, by the thinnest margin, did not collapse entirely. At 2 in the afternoon, the battle hung on a wire. If the infantry broke, if the grinding, exhausting, bloody work in the vineyards failed and the Ottoman counterattacks pushed the Allied forces back up the Kahlenberg slopes, there would be no cavalry charge. No charge, no relief. No relief, Vienna falls. Vienna falls, the map redraws. Everything balanced on the endurance of men who had been fighting for 9 hours with no food, no water, and no guarantee that any of it would matter. On the ridge, hidden behind the tree line, 3,000 winged hussars waited. They had been waiting since dawn. 9 hours in the saddle. 9 hours listening to the sounds of battle drifting up from the slopes below, the ceaseless crackle of musket fire, the deeper percussion of field artillery, the screaming that rose and fell in waves as attacks broke against defenses and defenses broke against attacks. 9 hours of watching the smoke thicken in the valleys and knowing that every sound represented men dying in their place, buying time with their bodies so that the cavalry would have its moment. The horses were restless. War horses trained for combat could sense approaching violence the way animals sense approaching weather, something in the vibration of the ground, something in the smell of powder smoke drifting uphill, something in the tension transmitted through the rider's thighs and hands and the barely perceptible tightening of the reins. They stamped. They snorted. Their muscles trembled beneath their riders with the contained energy of creatures bred for exactly one purpose. The hussars checked their equipment. Lances inspected for cracks. Sabers loosened in scabbards. Pistols loaded, one shot each, to be fired at point-blank range in the moment before the lance made contact, a technique designed to punch a hole in the enemy formation a half-second before the cavalry hit it. Armor straps tested. Wing mount secured. Stanislav, the man who left a letter for his daughter, sat his horse near the center of the Polish formation. His visor was raised. His face was calm in the way that faces become calm when fear has passed through them entirely and come out the other side, leaving behind something emptier and steadier than ordinary courage. He had made his confession that morning. He had received communion. His accounts with God and men were settled. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. And there was, in that surrender, a kind of freedom. At 4 p.m, Sobieski rode forward to the edge of the tree line and looked down. Below him, the battlefield spread like a canvas painted by a madman, smoke and fire and the moving specks of human beings locked in violence across a front 3 miles wide. The infantry battle raged in the vineyards and villages. Ottoman counterattacks pressed hard on the left. The center held, but barely, its lines visibly thinning as casualties accumulated and reserves dwindled. And beyond the infantry battle, behind it, below it, spread across the plains in every direction, the Ottoman camp. Mustafa's canvas city. The bazaars and the silk pavilions and the treasure and the prisoners and the supply wagons and the artillery parks and the headquarters from which the entire siege was directed. Unfortified. Here it was. The answer to the question planted hours ago, the reason Mustafa's refusal to storm the breaches was the most catastrophic military decision of the century. Not because it gave Vienna time to survive. Because it gave Mustafa the illusion of safety. He had spent 2 months with every engineer, every sapper, every resource pointed at Vienna's walls. Every trench faced south. Every cannon aimed at the city. Every defensive calculation assumed the threat came from one direction. He never built a single fortification facing north. No trenches. No earthworks. No artillery batteries aimed at the Kahlenberg Heights. No palisades. No defensive positions of any kind between his camp and the ridgeline where 70,000 Allied soldiers now stood looking down at him. His generals had begged him. They had cited military doctrine. They had invoked the basic principles of siege warfare that every Ottoman commander learned before he was old enough to shave. He had waved them away each time. Because he believed, with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who had never been wrong, that no one was coming. He was wrong. And now, at 4 p.m. on September 12, with his reserves committed forward into the vineyard fighting and his camp sitting naked behind a battle line stretched to its breaking point, the most powerful military commander in the Ottoman Empire had nothing between his headquarters and 3,000 winged hussars except open ground. Sobieski saw it. He had been waiting 12 hours for exactly this picture, the reserves committed, the line stretched, the camp exposed. He had bet everything on this single moment. Every mile of the march. Every hour the infantry had bled in the vineyards. Every prayer spoken on the hilltop in the darkness before dawn. He turned to his cavalry. 18,000 men. Poles, Austrians, Germans. At the tip of the formation, the very point of the spear, the 3,000 hussars. He drew his saber. The steel caught the late afternoon sun and threw light across the faces of the men closest to him, faces that were hard, focused, emptied of everything except the immediate and consuming reality of what they were about to do. He spoke. The words are recorded by multiple sources, consistent across accounts. Non nobis, Domini, non nobis, sed nomini tua de gloriam. Not to us, Lord. Not to us. But to your name give the glory. Psalm 115. The Crusaders' Psalm. The words spoken by men riding towards something they might not ride back from, offering the outcome, victory or death, glory or annihilation, to a power larger than themselves. Then a single word. Charge. The earth split open. That's not metaphor. That's what the men at the bottom of the hill experienced. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, a deep, subsonic tremor that bypassed the ears entirely and registered directly in the chest cavity, in the bowels, in the primal architecture of the nervous system that evolved over millennia to recognize the approach of something massive, something fast, something that could not be reasoned with or escaped. Then came the sound. 3,000 sets of wings hit full velocity simultaneously, and the noise they produced defied the vocabulary of every man who survived to describe it. A whistling. A shrieking. A roar. A sound that seemed to originate not from the riders but from the air itself, as though the atmosphere had been torn open and something behind it was screaming through the gap. It built as the cavalry accelerated, layered, harmonic, increasingly loud, until it filled the entire valley from ridge to ridge and drowned out the musket fire and the cannon fire and the human screaming and every other sound the battle had been producing for 12 hours. Ottoman soldiers on the perimeter heard it first. They turned. They looked uphill. What they saw broke them before the lances touched them. The setting sun sat directly behind the Kahlenberg Ridge. It backlit the cavalry charge in gold and crimson, turning each rider into a silhouette, a dark shape crowned with wings, growing larger with each second, multiplied by 3,000 into a wave that stretched across the hillside from one edge of vision to the other. The polished armor caught the angled light and threw it forward in blinding flashes. The feathered wings, backlit, enormous, inhuman in profile, rose above each rider like the pinions of something descended from a realm where mercy was not a recognized concept. It looked, from below, like the sky was falling. 18,000 horsemen, hussars at the spearhead, Austrian and German cavalry on the flanks, poured over the ridge and down the slope in a formation so dense that the ground beneath them disappeared entirely under hoofs. The distance from the tree line to the Ottoman perimeter was roughly 2,000 yards. At full gallop, a warhorse covers that distance in under 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was the window. That was the space between the moment the charge began and the moment it struck. In those 2 minutes, the Ottoman soldiers at the base of the hill had to process what they were seeing, understand its implications, form a defensive response, communicate that response to units on either side, reposition from offensive formations facing the infantry to defensive formations facing the cavalry, and physically prepare to absorb the impact of 18,000 horses at full velocity. They had 2 minutes to do what military doctrine requires 20. The front ranks managed to turn. Some leveled muskets. Some fired. At that distance, 1,000 yards and closing, the balls went wide or fell short or struck horses that stumbled and tumbled and threw their riders and were immediately replaced by the next rank surging forward over the fallen. The formation did not slow. It did not deviate. It came on like a wave, a physical, tonnage-driven wall of muscle and steel and velocity that obeyed no human command to stop because the horses had been bred for this, trained for this, built across generations for this exact purpose. 500 yards. The pistols fired. 3,000 simultaneous discharges, a ripple of flame across the front of the formation that punched holes in the Ottoman line a half-second before the lances arrived. Men dropped. Gaps opened. And into those gaps. Impact. 18-foot lances, driven by the combined momentum of a 1,200-pound horse and a 200-pound armored rider at 30 miles per hour, struck the Ottoman formation with a force that defied human-scale physics. The first rank did not bend. It did not break. It ceased to exist. Men and horses lifted off the ground by the kinetic energy of the impact, thrown backward into the ranks behind them, creating a cascading compression wave of falling bodies and shattering equipment that propagated through the formation like a shock wave through water. Lances shattered on impact, the hollow would design to break after the first penetration, preventing the rider from being unhorsed by a weapon embedded in a falling body. Sabers came out. 3,000 blades, drawn simultaneously, catching the dying light. And then the hussars were inside the Ottoman formation, cutting, wheeling, driving deeper, each rider operating in the trained, reflexive patterns drilled into muscle memory since adolescence. The Janissaries broke. Let that register. The Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, men selected in childhood, trained for decades, hardened by campaigns across 3 continents, regarded by every military strategist in Europe as the finest foot soldiers on earth, broke. Not because they were cowards. Not because they lacked training or discipline or courage. Because the human nervous system has limits. Mechanical, biological limits. Thresholds beyond which no amount of training can prevent the cascade failure of rational thought under overwhelming sensory input. The sound of 3,000 wings at velocity was beyond those thresholds. The sight of armored riders silhouetted against a burning sky was beyond those thresholds. The ground shaking, bone vibrating, chest compressing physical force of 18,000 horses hitting open ground at full gallop was beyond those thresholds. They ran. Not retreated. Ran. 80,000 men, soldiers who had conquered Hungary, who had besieged Vienna for 2 months, who had served an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Indian Ocean, threw down their weapons and fled. They trampled each other in the panic. They abandoned artillery batteries, supply wagons, entire encampments. They ran through their own camp, knocking over tents and scattering provisions and crushing men who fell beneath the stampede. The Ottoman camp, Mustafa's magnificent, unfortified canvas city, was overrun in minutes. Not hours. Minutes. Hussars rode through the bazaars where merchants had sold silk that morning. They rode past the musicians' pavilion where melodies had drifted toward starving Vienna the night before. They rode through the headquarters compound where Kara Mustafa Pasha had dined on lamb and honey and told ambassadors the siege was already won. Stanislav's lance broke on the 3rd impact. The shock of it, the sudden loss of the weapon he trained with since boyhood, barely registered. His saber was in his hand before the lance fragments hit the ground. He cut left. Cut right. His horse carried him deeper into the collapsing formation. Around him, the charge had become a flood, a torrent of steel and horseflesh pouring through gaps in the Ottoman line and spreading across the plains behind it, converting retreat into rout and rout into annihilation. He survived. That much the muster rolls confirm. His name appears on the post-battle accounting, marked present, marked wounded but mounted. His letter to his daughter had not become a farewell. Not every name on the rolls carried that notation. And Kara Mustafa Pasha, the man who had been promised the golden apple of world dominion, who had never lost a campaign, who had watched the siege of Vienna from silk cushions and told visiting diplomats it was merely a matter of time, ran. He ran from his own pavilion. He ran so fast, so completely consumed by the same panic that had swallowed his army, that he left behind his personal treasure. He left behind his gold. He left behind captured weapons, jeweled armor, diplomatic correspondence, maps of the European campaigns he had planned to launch after Vienna's fall. He left behind the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad. The most revered military relic in the Ottoman Empire, a banner carried into battle for centuries, a symbol so holy that its loss would resonate through the Islamic world like a physical blow, abandoned in a tent by a man who could not stop running long enough to take it with him. The man who was going to crack open Europe like a walnut ran from his own headquarters with nothing but the clothes on his back and the certain knowledge that what waited for him in Constantinople would be worse than anything the Hussars could have delivered with their sabers. If that doesn't earn a like, nothing in the history of warfare will. Hit the button. But don't leave, because what happened to both of these men after the battle is the part history doesn't put in the textbooks. And it's darker than anything that happened on that hillside. The wings went silent. The dust settled. The largest cavalry charge in human history was over. But the cost was still being calculated. And the man who paid the most would not be the one who lost. The first thing the Allied soldiers found when they entered Mustafa's camp was the silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of aftermath. The silence that fills a space where 150,000 men lived and ate and prayed and planned the conquest of a continent, and then, in the span of 20 minutes, vanished, leaving behind everything they owned and everything they were. Tents still stood. Cooking fires still smoldered. Meals sat half-eaten on plates that would never be cleared by the hands that filled them. It was as though the entire Ottoman army had been lifted out of the world mid-sentence, removed by some force so sudden and total that the physical evidence of their existence remained frozen in place like a painting of a life interrupted. Then the soldiers looked closer. And the silence became something else. Gold. Stacked in chests that hadn't been locked because no one had time to lock them. Silver plate, hundreds of pieces, engraved with calligraphy so intricate it must have taken artisans months to complete. Bolts of silk. Casks of spices. Weapons inlaid with jewels, sabers with ruby-studded hilts, daggers with emerald pommels, ceremonial armor that was worth more than most European estates. Sacks of coins from a dozen nations, Ottoman ackee, Hungarian ducats, Venetian sequins, the accumulated plunder of a campaign that had stripped the Balkans bare on its march west. And deeper in the camp, past the treasure, past the silk pavilions, past the collapsed bazaars where merchants had fled with nothing but their lives, prisoners. Christian captives. Hundreds of them. Men, women, children seized from conquered towns during the Ottoman advance and held for sale in the slave markets of Constantinople. Some had been captive for months. Some were children young enough that they no longer remembered the towns they had been taken from. They stood blinking in the late afternoon light, staring at the Allied soldiers with expressions that contained neither relief nor joy, only the flat, hollowed-out incomprehension of people who had stopped believing rescue was a concept that applied to them. A Polish officer opened a cage, an actual cage, wooden bars, straw floor, and found a boy inside. 8 years old. Austrian. He did not speak when the door opened. He simply walked out, looked up at the officer, and sat down on the ground as though he had been given no instructions for what a freed person is supposed to do. That image, a child sitting in the dirt beside the cage he had lived in, free and unable to understand it, is the image the victory deserves. Not the wings. Not the charge. Not the glory. A boy sitting in the dirt, trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Sobieski walked through the camp that evening. He saw the treasure. He saw the prisoners. He saw the banner of the Prophet Muhammad, recovered from Mustafa's abandoned pavilion and now held by a Polish cavalryman who understood its significance well enough to guard it with his life. He returned to his tent and wrote a letter to his wife, Queen Marie Casimir. The letter survives. It is the most human document to emerge from the entire campaign, not a military dispatch, not a report to a parliament, but a husband writing to the woman he loved after the longest day of his life. He described the Ottoman camp. The luxury. The gold. The scale of what Mustafa had built and abandoned. Then this line, the vizier took everything with him, except his honor. He also noted, almost as an afterthought, with the bemusement of a man too exhausted for full curiosity, sacks of a strange, dark bean found in enormous quantities throughout the camp. Nobody in the Allied army recognized them. Coffee. Within 10 years, Vienna would open its first coffee house, and within a generation, Viennese coffee culture would become one of the city's most celebrated traditions, born entirely from the spoils of the army that had spent 2 months trying to starve the city out of existence. History has a sense of humor. It is not always a kind one. Kara Mustafa Pasha reached Belgrade in October. He knew what was coming. A man does not lose the largest military engagement of the century, abandon the banner of the Prophet, and hemorrhage an empire's worth of treasure across the Hungarian plains without consequences. Ottoman governance did not operate on forgiveness. It operated on results. And Mustafa's result was the most catastrophic military humiliation in Ottoman history. Sultan Mehmed IV sent his verdict on Christmas Day, 1683. The messengers who carried it did not bring a letter. They brought a silk cord. The bowstring. The traditional Ottoman method of executing high-ranking officials who had failed beyond redemption. Strangulation, slow, deliberate, administered by court executioners who had perfected the technique across generations. It was considered more dignified than the sword. A courtesy reserved for men of status. The last privilege of rank. Mustafa received the executioners in a room in Belgrade. The accounts differ on whether he spoke. One source claims he said nothing. Another records a single sentence, a protest of loyalty to the Sultan that trailed off when the cord tightened. His head was removed after death. Placed in a velvet bag. Carried to Constantinople and presented to the Sultan as proof of completion. The man who was promised the golden apple of world dominion, who built a canvas city with bazaars and musicians while a real city starved a mile away, who dined on lamb and honey while children ate rats, who refused to look north because his own certainty had sealed his eyes shut, received, in the end, a silk cord and a velvet bag. The symmetry is not poetic. It is arithmetic. The Ottoman Empire dealt in outcomes, and Mustafa's outcome was measured in the currency every empire ultimately uses, death for failure. Power for success. Nothing in between. Now. The part no one teaches. Sobieski entered Vienna on September 13, the day after the battle. He rode through the gates of the city he had saved, through streets lined with survivors who reached toward him, who touched his boots, who wept and prayed and called his name with the desperate gratitude of people who had been counting their remaining hours in single digits. He expected nothing extravagant. He was not a vain man. But he expected, reasonably, humanly, acknowledgement. A meeting between equals. A handshake between the king who rode 500 miles through mountains and the emperor whose capital that king had pulled from the throat of annihilation. Leopold I refused. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the man who had fled Vienna in a gilded carriage while his people starved, returned to the city after the danger had passed and treated the man who had eliminated that danger with diplomatic coldness so calculated it bordered on cruelty. He would not meet Sobieski as an equal. Protocol, he insisted, forbade it. An emperor does not greet a king as a peer. Sobieski was a king, yes, but a Polish king. An Eastern king. A king of a nation that Habsburg Vienna regarded as a frontier buffer state, useful in a crisis, disposable afterward. They met eventually. Briefly. On horseback. A carefully staged encounter designed to minimize any appearance of equality, Leopold positioned slightly ahead, the greeting reduced to a few formal words, the entire interaction stripped of warmth or genuine gratitude with the precision of a court that had elevated pettiness to an art form. Sobieski wrote to Marie about the reception. The letter is shorter than his description of the Ottoman camp. The tone is different. Flatter. Harder. He did not use the word betrayal. He did not need to. The facts spoke in a language that required no translation. The promises broke next. The territorial concessions Austria had dangled before Poland to secure Sobieski's intervention, vague, carefully worded, designed to be interpreted flexibly, were reinterpreted into meaninglessness within months. The financial compensation promised for the cost of the march and the campaign never materialized. Austria's treasury, which could find money for court renovations and diplomatic banquets, could not find money for the kingdom that had saved its capital. Poland, already bankrupt from the war, received nothing. Not a ducat. Not an acre. Not a formal acknowledgement that amounted to more than words on paper that no one intended to honor. Sobieski returned to Poland. To a kingdom more exhausted than the one he had left, its treasury drained, its army depleted, its eastern borders unguarded during the months he had spent saving someone else's city. His nobles, who had opposed the march from the beginning, turned their opposition into open political warfare. The same blocked his initiatives. Rival factions maneuvered against him. The internal politics of Poland, always fractious, always corrosive, consumed whatever authority the victory at Vienna should have granted him. His health deteriorated. The damage of 3 decades of campaigning, the old wounds, the stressed joints, the accumulated toll of a body that had been ridden hard across too many battlefields, compounded with the exhaustion of the march and the particular, slow-acting poison of betrayal by those he had sacrificed everything to help. His kidneys failed. His heart weakened. His body, which had carried him through 30 major battles and 500 miles of mountain and storm, began the process of shutting down with the same methodical inevitability as an Ottoman mine collapsing a bastion. Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, died on June 17, 1696. 13 years after Vienna. He was 72. He died in Wilano Palace, in a bed, surrounded by the remnants of a court that had spent his final years undercutting his authority and dismantling his legacy with the enthusiasm of vultures working a carcass. He died, and this is the part that history buries beneath the glory and the wings and the thundering cavalry charges, bitter. Not the bitterness of a man who regretted his choices. The bitterness of a man who had made the right choice and watched the world punish him for it. Who had saved a civilization and received, in return, diplomatic insults, broken promises, and a kingdom sliding toward the abyss. He would not have to watch what came next. Perhaps that was mercy. Within a century of Sobieski's death, Poland was erased from the map of Europe. Not conquered. Partitioned, carved apart by 3 neighboring empires, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, in a series of diplomatic surgeries so precise and so cynical they were conducted with the same casualness with which a butcher divides a carcass. 3 partitions. 1772, 1793. 1795, each one slicing away another piece of the kingdom that had ridden to Vienna's rescue. Each one signed by nations that owed their survival, directly or indirectly, to the man who had led 3,000 winged riders down a hillside into the teeth of the impossible. Austria, the nation Sobieski saved, took the largest share. Let that sink in. The empire that fled its own capital. The emperor who refused to shake a Polish king's hand as an equal. The court that broke every promise it made to the man who bled for it. That empire carved apart his kingdom and absorbed his people and erased his nation from the map as though it had never existed. The Battle of Vienna permanently shattered Ottoman expansion into Europe. The empire that had threatened to swallow the continent whole never recovered from September 12, 1683. The tide that had been rising for 2 centuries crested on the Kahlenberg Heights and receded, slowly, irreversibly, across the following 200 years until the Ottoman Empire itself dissolved in the ashes of the First World War. That is the victory. Here is the cost. The man who delivered it was abandoned by those he saved. The kingdom that bled for it was devoured by those it protected. The charge that broke the Ottoman army did not break the selfishness, the ingratitude, or the ruthless self-interest of the nations that watched from behind their borders while Vienna starved. Those qualities survived the battle unscathed. They always do. 3,000 men rode into the impossible and shattered an empire. History gave them a painting and a paragraph. History gave the man who led them a slow death in a palace full of enemies and a kingdom that was already being measured for its coffin. The wings still echo. 340 years later, the sound still reverberates through every account of that September afternoon, that unearthly, shrieking, magnificent roar of eagle feathers catching the wind at full velocity. It is the sound of the single greatest cavalry charge in recorded human history. The sound of 3,000 men who chose to pay a price that the rest of a continent refused to acknowledge, let alone repay. But the man who wore those wings, the scarred, 60-year-old king who ignored every rational voice and rode south because something in his bones told him that civilization does not survive by calculation alone, died wondering if any of it had mattered. History eventually answered him. He was not alive to hear it. If this story changed how you see courage, or what it costs, subscribe to Dark History Exhumed. We don't tell the stories history is proud of. We tell the ones it tries to bury. Drop a comment below. Was Sobieski the greatest hero Europe ever produced, or was he a man the world used and discarded the moment his usefulness expired? I want to know what you think. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.